Dan Bublett's Comedy Productions.
My friend Dan, he's got a podcast, 'cause all comics need a podcast, and nobody had a podcast called The Art of Bombing. So Dan went out and bought a tape deck. Who knows why he bought a tape deck? Now podcasts don't get played on tape decks, but Dan is from the 80s. So hey there, all you funny jerks, come talk to Dan about your work. Tell him all about your worst times. It's The Art of Bombing. Welcome to an all-new Art of Bombing, Between Bombs recap of episode 266 with Adam Mamawala. If you listen to the episode that came out on Thursday, it was a great conversation that we had with Adam, fantastic comedian from New York City. If you haven't listened to that conversation yet, you might want to go back and listen to that, then come listen to this, because a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about are points, talking points, and takeaways that came up during that conversation. So you'll have a little bit more of a reference point if you go back and listen to the episode. And there was a lot of great takeaways, Josh. It was a great episode.
Yeah, it was a big one, and we covered a lot of ground. One of the questions that was resonating in my mind after listening to it was, what are some things that well-known comics do that create bad habits for comics that aren't well known? So the reason I ask is because in the discussion, Adam covers earning trust from the audience before doing certain types of jokes, right? You have to put your jokes in a certain order, which we've covered on a Between Bombs before in a more specific way. But he's talking about earning trust first before doing something dark or doing a long story or something that involves trust that you're going to need from the audience. You're going to have to build that first. And so here's what comes to mind. Like you get on Netflix or you get on YouTube and you watch the latest special from John Mulaney or insert famous comedian. And, they open with some long story, or you made the point we were talking off air, like Anthony Jeselnik comes out and has some disgusting story that, a normal comic wouldn't be able to do that.
No, they wouldn't be able to get away with that. Yeah, you're exactly right.
And I think a lot of times we, amateur comics or comics that are professional but aren't well known fall for that, right? Like, So if it's a John Mulaney comedy special, all of his fans are there. The trust and credibility that we need to establish with the audience for him in that case has already been established. So there's no need, for him to have to rebuild it with an opening set of jokes that's specifically designed for that purpose. And so we see it. We see some, long, complicated, opening bit, which is, it's just a total killer. And it kills because the trust has already been built.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's a couple things happening there. You've got trust that they've already built from already, doing the grind, if you will, or their comedic journey. They've built, they've established trust because they've built a fan base. So they've already, like you said, they got that established trust, but a lot of it's because they built a fan base. They've spent their career doing that, which gives them that pass. And like you said, if you're a newer comedian, you probably don't have a fan base. You can't just go start with whatever edgy or shock type of joke you want and get away with it. Like, you can do it, but it's probably going to backfire in your face. And just from this podcast alone, we've heard so many stories about bombing where that was the case, where they try to do a joke early on and, it might not have been offensive, but it might have been too dirty for the crowd or whatever the case might have been. But because they didn't have that trust, they couldn't get away with it. The crowd just wasn't going to let it happen.
No trust was just, I think the number one thing we hear is, I did a set I wasn't ready for. But number two is, I hadn't established credibility or trust with the audience first. And I went out and tried this bit and it didn't work. And that, then, this sort of domino effect of things happened. And the next thing I know, I'm arrested in Wyoming.
That's right.
So here's an example that comes to mind when I think about this idea, and we're focusing closely on how comics open. I think that's kind of where this journey's been taking us so far. But if you listen to, like, one of my favorite comics is Nate Bargatze.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's funny. He's more of a family comic, so I tend to listen to his stuff just because I kind of have to stop listening to him because he's burning premises for me. Like, I'm like, oh shit, that was a good. I had the same thought, and I start writing a joke, and he comes out with something, and he's already developed it, and now I can't do that bit, or it ruins it for me in some other way. But if you listen to his very first special, it's on YouTube, I think. It's where I found it last. It's from 10 or 12 years ago, and it's called "Yelled At by a Clown." It's great. It's a great album. But listen to him open. He's in front of a bunch of people he doesn't know. And he opens differently. I need to introduce myself to the crowd. I need to have a joke that's a high, probability joke. It needs to be, short sequences and not some long, drawn out story. So then, fast forward to, the most recent specials, or even the one right after that. I think the next thing he did was a Comedy Central special of some type. And, it was a more well-known special. He had been on TV, and people started to understand who he was. And he opens with a complex story. Great set, great reaction from the crowd, but it's kind of a no-no in terms of a comic trying to, introduce themselves to a crowd.
Yeah, absolutely. And that just made me think of another episode. The episode, I forget what number it was, but the comic was Nick Hoff. We had a conversation because he is one of the regular openers for Larry the Cable Guy. And that was something that he talked about on the episode, was his opening. Like, in those scenarios, nobody knows who he is, and they're not there to even see him. And so he has to establish right away that, hey, I'm aware you're not here for me, but we're going to do this. I'm here for the next, 15 minutes or whatever. So you really have to, and again, that's a form of establish, he knows he can't just go out there and do even any of his jokes, because he has to, start getting that trust and building that right away and introducing who he is as a person. And and that goes to being aware and just being, hey, I know you're not here to see me, but I'm here. So
yeah. Another thing that came up on the discussion with Adam was this idea of how comics are really focused on the journey. In other words, comics can be, distrustful or petty, I think, is a word that he uses to describe comics. And unfortunately that's true. Comics on a scene, if you're new to the scene, in a way, they selfishly want to see you have to go through the same rite of passage they did.
Yeah, there's a lot of gatekeeping involved in that, it seems like.
Why is that? Why do comics want to... Why do they hold on to that so tightly? Why are they so territorial?
That's a good question. I think that sometimes it especially depends on scene to scene, but, they have these reputations of the scenes. And one thing I've noticed, because I can speak on this because I moved around a lot. And one thing I've noticed, because I've encountered this quite a bit, where I come in as a new person and people, automatically just think I'm a new comic altogether or whatever. And that's the mentality they have about me. And one thing I've noticed is, if the scene has a really, good reputation or whatever, they're really more protective of it. But the one thing with that, a lot of the people who are into that, like gatekeeping and edgelording, or not edgelording, but gatekeeping, and the whole, you got to pay your dues, is either, usually it's two scenarios. It's older, bitter comedians that haven't quite made it, or it ends up just being open micers. Like the true professionals, don't care because they're not that. I mean, they're involved in their scenes, but they're not that involved in their scenes. They're too busy getting booked and doing comedy.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right about the professionals. Look, this is something I spend my life doing. I'm here to get better. I'm here to work on some specific jokes if I am at an open mic at all. And I'm not really worried about whose first time it is or what trials they have to go through or that it has to be more or like mine. I think that's a good takeaway.
Oh, absolutely. I'd like to add on that too, just because, with that, you have to have a certain journey or, every comic's got to do whatever. Well, we all know that that's just not the case. Every comic has their own journey. But when you're in a scene and somebody new comes in, I get, there's a lot of times there's hesitation when there's a new comic because you're like, oh, another new comic. How long are they even going to be here? Are they worth even getting to know, or should I just be standoffish? Whatever, yada, yada, yada. But when somebody comes in from another scene or, and you have to get to know people in order to know that. If I move to a new scene and people don't actually talk to me or ask me questions about my background in comedy, they're not going to know. But also, I don't want to just be running around being like, well, I did this, this, and this, because then that makes me sound, like a jerk and self-centered and conceited and all those things like that. So there's a fine line between that. But I feel like if you're in a scene, don't you want your scene to grow with better talent? So if a comic that's already been doing comedy for, 3, 4, 5, 6 on and on years moves to your scene from another scene and starts coming around to the mics and the showcases and things like that, wouldn't you want to welcome them and make them feel welcome because now they're making your scene better? It's kind of like with sports, when players get traded, that kind of thing, or get bought. They go to different teams, and, that's ultimately to make the team better. Yeah.
And, to me, I think comics are protective of the art form in a way, because comedy is not like other arts, specifically even other performance arts in one very specific way. And that is that you can't shortcut it. There's no way.
No.
Like my friends have, an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old and they're both, young girls, and they go out in auditions and stuff like that. And there's a chance that one of them could get a part in a Steven Spielberg movie, get noticed in some way that they're up for some Academy Award. And it's, just, you can shortcut acting in a way because you can be talented and put into the right role, have directors and storytellers around you, other people writing the words that are coming out of your mouth. And what you're doing is such an expression of everyone else's input that you can shortcut the same for musicians. I mean, you can be ultra talented at playing, certain instruments or singing, and you're not necessarily in charge of having to come up with the material that you're using. Mm-hmm. And so you have in comedy, just, it's well known that you can't shortcut it. And no one has ever made it successfully in comedy immediately.
No, I mean, there are ways technically you can shortcut if you blow up on Instagram or TikTok or, YouTube. But usually what happens in those scenarios is that, and it's not all cases, but most cases, they never get good at doing comedy. They're able to sell out a room, but they don't get good.
That's right. Look at the example that Adam gives us in the episode, right? Like, mm-hmm. Dane Cook has some big thing blow up, some big album, and he says, yeah, it's a great album, but it's a culmination of everything he had done up to that point. And in his certain career, in Adam's opinion, this guy's not necessarily ready to put 60 Minutes together every year the way Louis C.K. or Dave Chappelle can. And that was exposed to everybody when he came out with his second album, and it wasn't as strong as the first one, and then he kind of faded away. So, yes, I think under some circumstances, everybody can say, this guy's funny or this gal is funny. Let's give them an album. Let's cut a deal and, have them perform in front of a crowd. And, maybe parts of it hit, maybe it's funny, but if you want to churn jokes in and out, you have to be in touch with yourself in terms of a voice. You have to be able to write jokes. You have to know how to cultivate those jokes in front of audiences. That takes a long time.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, because we talked about that, Adam and I did talk about that with, comics who are, doing these new specials every year, like just pumping out material. And the more they pump it out, the less quality. It isn't as good. You see this with a lot of comedians, it's
even good ones,
ones. Yeah. Their material.
They do some money grab because, they make some deal with Netflix right after they had a special come out 8 months earlier on Amazon Prime. Now they're out with a new special because that was what the contract said. And it's every new idea they've had in the last 8 months. And it's just totally uncooked. I mean, I don't want to get into finger pointing or name calling, but several comics that I love have done that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It happens a lot. I mean, and at the end of the day, can't blame them for wanting to get paid and get that paycheck.
Yeah, but it's not. Yeah, but the quality isn't there,
Yeah.
And you, as a comic, you can definitely tell. Audiences are going, it wasn't as funny as the previous special.
And then it makes you wonder: will those audiences, stop being your fan, or will they continue to support you because they like you? It's an interesting thing because that's what could happen. I mean, it's just like when you do, anything bad, that's why when you're early on in your career, you definitely need to be careful on what you're doing, what performances you're doing and who you're bringing, like if you're not ready to, headline or whatever it might be, or you're trying to get an audition for something and, you're not ready. You shouldn't be having industry people try to come to your show or whatever it might be. There's a bazillion different scenarios that you could have where you're going to go and bomb and it's because you're just not ready. And then you're bombing in front of these important people. And now that's what they see. So then it takes you that much longer to get back up there to where, I am good. See, but they're going to always be hesitant, especially with friends. You invite your friends to an open mic and you eat it.
Yeah,
you're going to have a heck of a hard time getting them to come see you again.
I'm a living proof of that. Yeah. And it wasn't an open mic. It was a show that I produced. I may have talked about this on the show before, but, I 6 months into comedy. I'm like, okay, I got it figured out. I'm going to bring people out to the show. And I just wasn't good, and there's still people out there who are like, nah, I'm, don't want to come see me probably because, they're like, yeah, it was fun that one time. I'm not a fan of stand-up comedy, so I don't really want to.
The nice way of saying, I just don't think you're funny.
Right. And based on that sample size, they're right. But so many comics do that. Yeah. So many comics.
Yep. No, absolutely. You gotta be ready. Got to be ready for it, and if you're not, even if you go through and you trial by error, you got to be ready to lose those fans because that's what's going to happen.
Get ready to lose those fans. That is what happens. So I you guys covered some things about corporate gigs and all of that. And I think he gave us a couple of examples of not getting paid. So what I wrote down in my own notebook after listening was make sure in the contract terms somewhere that if the show gets interrupted, it's over.
Yeah.
If you don't think it's going well and you need to pull me off stage, I'm not going back out there because A, I know you're not going to pay me. And B, what's going to happen now?
That reminds me, I'm going to have to put that stipulation in my contracts. Yes. So good. I just took that note. I need to message my corporate booking manager and have him add that clause into the contract. Because that's a great point. Yeah, those stories, that was crazy. And the fact that it happened twice on two different occasions is wild. But it
sounds like he didn't have the trust of the audience. It kind of goes back to some of his other reflection. Mm-hmm. Didn't have the trust of the audience, went out there on some material, and he owns it. He's like, I shouldn't have told those jokes. I shouldn't have done those things. But
Yeah.
F them, because they shouldn't have like sent me out there, thus writing this sort of verbal contract that I'm going to go on with the show and finish it and do my job, and then decide later not to pay me.
Yeah. Well,
You
and
know,
it sounded
and
like
it's-
in one of the instances, it was a matter of just one person was offended, which was the CEO. And it wasn't
right.
like the
Well-
actual staff. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
it's like,
yeah, he gets reviews later from
Yeah.
people that were like, "Look, hey, if it was my decision, right?"
yeah. So it's like, that's where the fine line, but that's the situation with corporate gigs is the people who hire you are the only ones that matter. So you can go and do a corporate gig and bomb the whole show. But
Right.
as long as the event person who hired you and the management approved and enjoyed themselves, that's all that matters. Yeah,
That's right.
That's who you have to impress, unfortunately. I mean, obviously you don't want to go and bomb because nobody likes bombing, but those are the people you have to impress in those scenarios, or like you end up not getting paid. And I was surprised too with that. Again, and that kind of goes back to probably where he was in his career, and the lack of. We talk about it a lot on this podcast about having the tools in your tool belt to handle different situations, and the fact that his manager was just like, you know what? It's not worth it to me. I'll lose a lot of money if I go up to bat for you. So you're just not getting paid. You know, if he had the right tools in his tool belt, he might have been, he might have got rid of them right away. He might have been like, well, that's fine. This obviously isn't going to work, but wasn't at that level yet to where he could. And you have to weigh those, pros and cons, because it's like, well, I didn't get paid for this gig, which sucks. Now, shit, if I fire my manager and I don't have management, now how am I going to get booked? And, so
That may have been what he was faced with, at that time.
Yeah.
I had an agent, a couple of agents in New York, and, they did some stupid agent things. And, it's not like I could just be like, well, I'm in such demand that I'll easily replace this. Right. Agents can be hard to get.
Yeah,
So,
supply and demand
that
for
sucks.
sure.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that's going to do it for this episode of Between Bombs. We hope you enjoyed the new format going forward. That's what we're going to be doing. You can look for next week's episode. Our guest is Gary Lewis. He's a comedian that is based in Sioux City, Iowa. He's been doing comedy for 30-plus years. Lots of crazy road stories in that conversation. And he's just a fun guy to be around and talk to, and has had a lot of experiences. So that's coming up next week, and then next Monday we'll be back with another episode of Between Bombs, recapping our conversation with Gary Lewis and getting talking about those takeaways, getting that comedy incite your mind. That's stupid. All right, let's get at it. Make sure you follow the show. Thanks for listening.
This has been a Dan Bublitz comedy production. Raw.